The Great American Oil Paradox and West Coast refinery collapse. Today, I want to run through one of the most misunderstood narratives in global energy. The idea that America's shale revolution has made it energy independent. The headline is real. The US is the world's largest oil producer and exporter, but the mechanism underneath tells a very different story. By the end of the session, we'll understand why Hormuz is not just a Middle East problem. It's a California problem, a diesel problem, and ultimately a real economy problem. Paradox defined. Core mechanism. The US shale boom produced enormous volumes of light sweet crude, but approximately 70% of US refinery capacity was built to process heavy sour crude. The infrastructure mismatch means the US simultaneously exports its surplus light crude to Asia and Europe, whilst importing the heavy crude its refineries can actually require from Canada, Mexico, Venezuela, Iraq and Saudi Arabia. This is not a temporary market anomaly. It's a structural condition baked into decades of capital investment. So we can see the asymmetry. Record production, yet record crude imports. This is the paradox. The crude quality mismatch. What the US produces: light, sweet, shale crude, low viscosity, low sulfur. Primary production zones: Permian Basin, Bakken and Eagle Ford. Record output of approximately 13.5 million barrels per day. Surplus exported to Asia and Europe. What US refineries need: heavy sour crude, high viscosity, high sulfur content. Sources: Canada, Mexico, Venezuela, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. 90% of US crude imports are heavier than domestically produced shale crude. Retooling a single refinery to handle lighter crude will be between 100 million and a billion, closer to $1 billion capital cost. Without subsidies or tax incentives, the economic case for retooling is weak. Why can't they simply switch? Refineries are highly capital intensive, purpose-built infrastructure. A Gulf Coast coker unit designed to process the heaviest Venezuelan or Canadian bitumen cannot simply be refigured to handle Permian light crude economically. The cracking units, hydrotreaters and cokers were each specified to a crude slate. As the American fuel and petrochemical manufacturers note, nearly 70% of US refining capacity runs most efficiently with heavier crude. This is why 90% of crude imports are heavier than domestic shale output. Okay, let's say the industrial economics call this classic capital lock-in problem. Sunk costs and path dependency preventing optimal resource allocation. The shale revolution in the US created an abundance of the wrong type of oil for their existing infrastructure. The diesel economy, the hidden vulnerability. Why diesel matters more than petrol. The US economy does not run on petrol, it runs on diesel. Heavy crude is the primary feedstock for distillate production. Light shale crude yields insufficient heavy fractions to meet domestic diesel demand. This creates a structural import dependency that persists regardless of shale output volumes. Consider road freight. All long-haul trucking, the backbone of US goods distribution. Rail freight, coal, grain, consumer good, industrial materials. Agriculture, tractors, combine harvesters, irrigation pumps, grain dryers, acute seasonal demand. Construction, earth movers, cranes, generators, infrastructure program exposure. Heating oil, northeast US residential heating, directly heavy crude derived. The structural implication. Since US shale cannot yield sufficient heavy fractions to meet domestic diesel demand, the economy is structurally vulnerable to disruptions in heavy crude supply, regardless of how much light crude is produced domestically. Imports are not merely economically convenient, they are mechanically necessary. Okay, so diesel is the circulatory system of the physical economy. Petrol gets the headlines, but diesel moves the freight, grows the food, builds the infrastructure. This Hormuz disruption that tightens heavy sour crude supply globally squeezes the feedstock for diesel production, not just for refineries importing Middle Eastern crude, but for the US market through second-order price transmission. Think about it. Refinery capacity, stagnation and collapse. The national picture, no expansion. Marathon, Valero, ExxonMobil all reported calendar day capacity increases of under 1% in 2025, minor process improvements, not meaningful expansion, no major refinery expansions or transactions occurred between January 24 and January 25. The Lyndall-Bassell Houston refinery permanently ceased operations in January 25, removing 263,776 barrels per calendar day of capacity. West Coast and California closure timeline. This is important. 2020 Marathon Martinez refinery closed permanently. 2022 Phillips 66 Rodeo converted to renewable diesel only, exits conventional fuel production. January 2025 Lyndall-Bassell Houston permanently closed. October 2025 Phillips 66 Los Angeles Wilmington ceased conventional crude processing, another 139,000 barrels a day removed. April 2026 Valero Bencia Bay Area operation ceased, another 145,000 barrels per day removed, all in California. The regulatory driver. Valero's CEO described California's regulatory and enforcement environment as the most stringent and difficult of anywhere else in North America. The low carbon fuel standard, environmental litigation costs, and declining in-state demand all contributed to the exit decisions. The political framing, California Democrats versus the energy industry, obscures the more important supply chain consequence. Okay, the mainstream press is about California regulation versus big oil. That's the A variable. The C variable, the one that most markets are missing, is what replaces this capacity, where it comes from, and what supply chain it now runs through. That is where Fry's thesis lives. West Coast refinery collapse, the numbers. Capacity impact. Combined Phillips 66 LA and Valero Bencia closures, 284,000 barrels per day removed. 17% of California's total refinery capacity eliminated. 11% of PAD 5, entire West Coast, capacity eliminated. West Coast gasoline production reduced approximately 9%. West Coast jet fuel production reduced approximately 3%. West Coast diesel production reduced approximately 5%. So the import dependency consequence. Given the West Coast's limited pipeline connectivity to Gulf Coast refining hubs, the most likely replacement source is imports from Asia, particularly India and South Korea. California's unique carbob gasoline blend specification required by the state environmental regulations can only be produced by properly equipped refineries. Only a small number of facilities in India and South Korea meet these specifications. Furthermore, the Jones Act, passed 1920, requires that goods transported between US ports must use US-built, US-owned, US-crewed vessels. It's very odd. Only approximately 55 Jones Act compliant oil tankers exist globally, versus 7,000 plus tankers worldwide. This forces some product to be routed via the Bahamas before reaching California, adding cost, time and logistical fragility. Okay, this is where we move from macro to micro. When we talk about California being dependent on Indian and Korean refineries for its unique specification petrol, we're now talking about supply chains that run through the same geopolitical stress zones as our Hormuz thesis. The Jones Act routing via the Bahamas is not a footnote. It's a visible symptom of the institutional fragility in the US. Hormuz direct linkage, the C variable. Market consensus, the A variable. US energy independence means Hormuz disruption is primarily an overseas problem, affecting net import-dependent economies like Japan, South Korea and Europe, not the US. The mechanism, C variable. The US imports approximately 700 barrels per day from Saudi Arabia and Iraq combined, majority requiring transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Distribution patterns created concentrated regional exposure because Gulf Coast refiners access domestic crude via pipeline. Persian Gulf imports flow disproportionately to PAD 5, that's California and the West Coast. A Hormuz disruption hits Long Beach and Bay Area import terminals first, precisely where local refining capacity has been gutted and substitution options are limited. US tariff policy on Canadian and Mexican crude forces Gulf Coast refiners toward Middle Eastern spot markets for heavy sour feedstock, also Hormuz exposed. Venezuela sanctions compound the heavy sour deficit. Valero's senior executive acknowledged holes in our supply plan with 30 days notice. California's replacement import supply from India and South Korea now runs through the same supply chains as Hormuz stress. The contagion pathway has lengthened and deepened. Analytical framework, Peter and the Wolf. Each ceasefire headline is a sentiment event. The supply constraint mechanism, physical crude routing through Hormuz to West Coast import terminals, does not change with the ceasefire announcement. The wolf remains whether or not the villagers believe Truth Social. Cascading failure risk. USC and USC Berkeley analysis 2026. Professors at the University of Southern California and UC Berkeley released analysis warning California is on the brink of a cascading fuel supply failure that will impact not just the state, but the entire West Coast and US military installations. Up to 20% further loss of remaining Californian refinery capacity projected by the end of 2026. California's largest northbound crude pipeline faces potential shutdown. 65% collapse in in-state California oil production. Domestic crude availability accelerating decline. EIA projects West Coast gasoline prices could reach $4.19 per gallon in 2026. Oh, that's right. While the USC Berkeley analysis projects that those prices could double relative to the national average. US military installations on the West Coast directly exposed to fuel supply vulnerabilities. EIA's formal warning. The US Energy Information Administration has formally warned that refinery retirements on the West Coast increase the risk of higher gasoline prices in PAD 5. PAD 5 is Petroleum Administration for Defense District 5. The EIA short-term energy outlook incorporates these closures and projects dips in finished fuel stocks to levels not seen since the early 2000s. The point about US military installations is not rhetorical. It reflects a genuine national security concern that is now being discussed in congressional testimony. When fuel supply for Pacific Command logistics is at risk from a combination of domestic refinery closure and Hormuz disruption, the geopolitical and financial theses converge. This is the lattice work of theory that connects our positions. Summary. The energy dominance narrative is a sentiment event, not a supply resolution event. The US exports what it produces, light shale, and imports what it mechanically needs, heavy sour diesel feedstock. 70% of US refinery infrastructure is physically mismatched to domestic output. This cannot be fixed quickly or cheaply. California has lost 17% of refining capacity in 6 months. It now depends on India, South Korea, and the Bahamas for its uniquely specified fuel. The marginal barrel to California is now Asian sourced and Hormuz exposed. See variable. Markets are pricing the Phillips 66 and Valero closures as a California regulatory story. Fryer reads them as a Hormuz contagion, pre-positioning. Diesel is the real economy. Diesel requires heavy crude transit Hormuz. The chain is unbroken. Okay. The central energy independence narrative fails to survive disaggregation investigation. When we separate crude type, regional distribution, and supply chain provenance, the US West Coast is more exposed to Hormuz today than at any point in the last decade. The refinery closures did not insulate California, they deepened its vulnerability. Happy days, happy trading.